Strategy should be simple. And what I mean by simple is it should get to the heart of what the strategic challenge is that an organization is facing. When you start talking to clients or members of their organization, you might hear a huge number of different issues get raised, a huge number of different challenges that an organization seems to be facing. And what you have to do as the strategic advisor is find a way to cut through that noise, to try and get to essentials. Because what you'll find is that so much of what you hear is really symptomatic. These are symptoms of bigger issues. And getting down, just cutting it back layer by layer to get down to what the real root causes might be. That is the essence of good strategy.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on people and their stories. This podcast series is kindly supported by Franklin Templeton and Alvine Capital. Franklin Templeton is a global investment management firm that provides a broad range of investment solutions, including mutual funds, ETFs, alternative investments, wealth management, and technology-enabled financial services. Founded in 1947, the firm manages approximately $1.8 trillion in assets under management and serves individual and institutional investors across more than 150 countries. Alvine Capital was founded in 2005. It's European-focused private capital advisory and placement agent that provides capital raising services to investment managers from its bases in London and Stockholm. It creates bespoke capital raising programs that blend appropriate investor targeting and sophisticated marketing to deliver a fundraise aligned with institutional expectations. I'm joined today by Matthew Kentridge, a strategy consultant with over 30 years experience, who's a trustee and advisor and also works as an executive coach. We are both at INSEAD together, and I have followed his career ever since, and I'm delighted now to bring some of his learnings to our audience. Welcome, Matthew. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Ethan. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's such a treat to be talking to you in general and an honor to be invited onto your podcast.
Well, thank you so much. And we met at INSEAD and our careers went in different directions. But I've recently been really inspired by a lot of your LinkedIn posts with some of your coaching nuggets. So that was what inspired me to invite you back here and tie the work that you're doing now in coaching and evolving from strategy consulting to the work that I do, which is very focused around finance, as well as also coaching and encouraging people to take charge of their careers. So lots of overlap. But before we get into all of that, I'd love to just quickly touch on your background, where you grew up, what you studied, and how you entered the world of strategy consulting.
Well, as you know, and your listeners can probably tell, I'm a South African. So I was born in Johannesburg and grew up there. I've now lived in London for the last 20 years, but as I say, I grew up in South Africa, and the first part of my career was there. I did a master's in the economics of development at Cambridge. And I thought that my life would be one of being a development economist. That's what I expected was going to happen to me. But in fact, what happened is I went back to South Africa just as the transition to democracy was happening, as the transition away from apartheid to democracy was taking place. And it was a time of change and new openings and new possibilities in the country. And one of the things that happened was that companies that had disinvested from South Africa or never invested there suddenly started to come into the country. And among those companies were strategy consultancies who were coming into what was then an entirely untapped market. One of those companies was the Monitor Company. It's now part of Deloitte. And I joined them, and that's, I guess, where I cut my strategy teeth. And those early years, Ethan, they run deep, because I find when I am doing work with my current clients and when I'm writing my blogs, that a lot of what I have to say or a lot of what I draw on is actually information and insights that I got in those early days with Monitor in Johannesburg. There's also an opportunity to have a lot of different experiences. So my clients in those days, I had platinum mining and coal mining, chemical companies, refineries. I worked on a project for an offshore oil exploration company in South Africa, retail companies, fast-moving consumer goods. We had Coke and Pepsi squaring off against each other. And then also government work, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Transport, and so forth. So one couldn't really ask for a better grounding
It's so interesting. I also cut some of my teeth early in emerging markets, in my case, Asia. And I think there is a profound impact of working when there's such transformational change. And also, you are really, I think, working with no playbook. I'm sure the monitor playbook for elsewhere in the world didn't necessarily apply there. There was a lot of improvisation and also operating without a map, which is definitely something that lays down its impression for a later career. I also am really intrigued by the development economics background because I've had some international lawyers on this podcast. And what I've always asked on the international law front is about coping with ideas or with concepts that are bigger than us, with massive change that may never happen in our lifetimes. And I think maybe that also gives you a very long-term time perspective. I'm just guessing with having got some kind of training in development economics.
Yeah, you're right. It definitely gives one a long-term perspective. But I was also doing my master's and doing my development economics master's, what I think of as quite a low point in the kind of history of development and development thinking and philosophy since the Second World War, because this was the late 1980s and there had been development economics and development ideologies underway for 30 to 40 years, and they had really achieved very little in that time. And so the kind of traditional modes of development economics at that time were a bit disillusioning. Our course was all about examples of graft and corruption and theft and money being wasted and squandered. And there weren't really very good solutions yet at that point. And that was something that I guess it was obviously, as I say, quite disillusioning if you were a student then, but it also colored the way that I then looked at my career, which was to say, I only want to do something if there's going to be some sort of tangible result, some tangible outcome or some tangible benefit that I can point to or that I can see from the work that I do. And that philosophy, if you like, was one of the things that also shaped the trajectory of my career. So beyond Monitor, because one of the things that my time at Monitor made me think about and worry about was you could work hard, you could come up with what seemed to be great solutions, you could be working with brilliant teams, amazing people, reputable firm, great world thinkers. It was often hard to point to what changed or what happened as a result of all of this work. And that made me feel much more inclined to get involved in more transformative, more implementation-focused work. And that took me from Monitor to companies like Capgemini and A.T. Kearney, which are more focused on transformation. And I'd say that's been a thread that's run through for me ever since.
Fascinating. So just taking that now into maybe some of your core beliefs, and we'll talk about your approach to coaching. Would you say that there are any kind of key truths that you've taken with you from that vast experience that you now hold self-evident and operate with in the work you do today?
There are, I would say, probably many of them. I mean, you'll recall when we were at INSEAD together, one of the core courses that everyone had to do was OB, organizational behavior. And you may also recall that for many people, many members of our cohort, this was seen as a very soft option. They were quite dismissive of it. They didn't think that this was, what we should be doing as MBA students. But in fact, you'll also recall that I was one of the older people amongst our cohort at INSEAD, and I had been working longer than many people. And what those extra years tell you is that, in fact, an understanding of organizational dynamics, of the behaviors and incentives of people in an organization are often what make the difference between success and failure, and what either enable change to take place or what kill off change. And so, in terms of my core beliefs, this need to understand organizational dynamics, to understand the intersection of people with structure, with operating models is absolutely critical. And if you are too focused on kind of hard analytics, you can miss that. So that would be one of my big takeaways. And the other, I guess, core belief that's been shaped for me is that strategy should be simple. And what I mean by simple is it should get to the heart of what the strategic challenge is that an organization is facing. When you start talking to clients or members of their organization, you might hear a huge number of different issues get raised, a huge number of different challenges that an organization needs to be it seems to be facing. And what you have to do as the strategic advisor is find a way to cut through that noise, to try and get to essentials. Because what you'll find is that so much of what you hear is really symptomatic. These are symptoms of bigger issues. And getting down, just cutting it back layer by layer to get down to what the real root causes might be. That is the essence of good strategy and the essence of what is required in order to build a solution or a way forward that moves an organization forward. So I'd say those are very critical issues for me that I have come to understand, but also that take on greater importance for me as my career progresses.
I want to ask you about time frame, because I think what's quite popular today is, 5-year strategies, it's time-bound strategies. And I suppose some of the great strategic thinkers I've been listening to would say, well, that doesn't make sense because there's so little we've had control about in the next 5 years. That strategy has to be kind of a continuous and iterative process. What would be your view on that?
You probably have heard the quote, and I think it's from Eisenhower, that planning is essential and a plan is worthless. And that goes hand in hand with Mike Tyson's aphorism that everyone has a plan or a strategy until they're punched in the mouth. And I think that is kind of what the people you're referring to are talking about. And I do understand it. My view on this is that having a 3-year strategy or a 5-year strategy is a useful way of concentrating the mind. It's a useful way of saying, look, where are we today? Where are we trying to get to? And what are the many different pathways that might take us there? And if you don't pause and ask yourself those questions and then think about, what that route map might be or what that journey could look like, you are going to be floundering and your responses are going to be ad hoc and not very well thought out. So I think it is a good exercise to think about what your 5-year strategy should be and to do the work, do the thinking, write it down, share it, socialize it in the organization. But having said that, you then also have to accept that what you've written down needs to be flexible and adaptable. In particular, you have to be very, very clear in your head about what the assumptions are that you're using today, 2026, to write that strategy, and which may change. They may change by June, they may change by December or by next March. And when the assumptions change, that's the point at which you have to rethink the implications of those assumptions. So I think you do need to do a strategy. You can do a 5-year strategy, but you need to check in, see if the assumptions still hold up, see if they've changed, and therefore if the thinking has to be refreshed. In the old days, people would do a sort of midterm review of a strategy after 2.5 to 3 years. Now you have to do it more often than that.
That's really interesting. And taking it now to personal strategy, individuals, their careers, their plans, because that is, I think, where some of your coaching is now focused at the individual level. Can you talk about what you've been posting on LinkedIn, on those blogs that I think tickled my imagination in terms of wanting to speak with you? Some messages about feedback, about approaching a career. What have been some of your core messages that are part of your coaching practice?
Well, my blog really came about from this idea that I had in my head that I had been a strategy consultant for a long time. I'd had, if you like, several different careers within the broad umbrella of strategy. And as a result of that, I'd seen quite a lot of different situations, different organizations, different types of clients, different challenges that I, as a strategist, and my colleagues would have faced over time, and that I had a story to tell about them and I had experiences to share. And so I started writing some of them down. There would be almost like a toolkit for somebody starting out in consulting today, how to work effectively with clients, how to understand and navigate your way through political dynamics, either in your own organization or your client's organization, why it's so difficult to find excellence in what apparently are excellent organizations. But when you get into them, it's quite hard to find those pockets. And the more I started writing about that, the more I started thinking about some of the real fundamentals, which I think fall into the coaching bracket. How do you learn from the work that you're doing? And so I wrote a blog about feedback. And one of the things I said about feedback is that many organizations, certainly at Monitor when I started out, but probably in most consulting companies and probably most companies in the world, they would say emphasize feedback a lot and say it's very, very important. And yet, in reality, either the feedback doesn't really happen or it doesn't happen well. And So from a coaching point of view, one of the things that I was talking about was, firstly, how to give and receive feedback, kinds of environments you need to be in, and the kinds of how receptive you should be and what your mindset needs to be, but also how to then make it real, practical, and actionable for the person who's receiving it. And that then takes you from, okay, I've heard the feedback, what do I do about it? And that takes you in naturally into a kind of coaching conversation. And so I started writing about that. So I think those would have been some of the blogs that you've seen. And, I've had, I would say, very positive responses to the blogs. And the responses are often focused on the fact people like clarity, so that they feel that it's very helpful to have these issues laid out in quite a clear way. They like a bit of humor about it. They like some of the examples that I give, because I try to look at just things that are happening in the world, real things around us, to illustrate some of the points. So I'll give you a couple of examples, Ethan. I'm a big fan of the reality TV show Below Decks. And one of the reasons I'm a fan of it is not just because I love the sea and sailing, but because it is the best example I've ever seen of what bad teamwork looks like. And so if you want to write about what bad teamwork looks like, you can use that as an example. But similarly, I've worked for some of the most reputable, highest brand name NGOs in the world, which are characterized by what I would call an absence of excellence in the work that they do. And yet within those organizations, there are pockets here and there where excellence rarely shines out. And so I've written about that. What is it about those moments that enable excellence to happen in these organizations, and why is it so hard for that to be replicated more widely? And I've also written about what great strategy looks like in execution. And there is a charity in South Africa called Kula Education that I'm proud to be a trustee of. And they are a small charity. They do astonishing work in rural schools in one of the most remote parts of South Africa. And the work they do is the perfect encapsulation of what good strategy looks like in action. And I've written about that as well in the blogs. And I think people respond to the fact that the examples I give are drawn from the real world. They're not made up. They exist.
That's great. I'm going to go back and consult some of those case studies. Something you said earlier really interested me, because I don't think this problem has been fixed yet. And I'm maybe going to coin a word for it, kind of leakage, which is the difference between the express strategy or even the express, I'm thinking more about the behaviors maybe, or culture, such as around feedback. And then you said what actually happens in practice. And my sense is that this, I suppose, inauthenticity, because it's a gap between what's said, by what leaders say and what they do, is really detected at junior levels. That's how kind of poor culture then starts to germinate and spiral. What would you say is the reason for that leakage? And how can we address it? Because I don't see that that's actually happening, I think, more and more, particularly as the kind of great unity of some of the COVID days and the great commitment to corporate culture, as that kind of fades into the distance.
I agree with you, Ethan. I think there is a lot of leakage, and I think there are many reasons for that. I mean, one of the reasons, of course, relates to incentives. Quite often in organizations, they talk about something like feedback or internal coaching, but it's a kind of lip service, in the sense that the more senior people are really not incentivized to spend a lot of their time and effort doing that. And so to the extent that it happens at all, it can be quite token. And as you rightly say, there's nothing that's easier for somebody to detect than an inauthentic interaction or a tokenistic bit of feedback or coaching. So that's one of the reasons. Another is that people often feel that it's easier just to do the job themselves than to try and give feedback to somebody more junior who may have done a pass at the job and it wasn't quite up to scratch, or it's easier just to do it than to spend time coaching someone. And that's firstly, I think, a very short-sighted way of building an organization. It's a very short-sighted way of being a leader and building trust and capabilities amongst your team. But it does, as you correctly say, have a cultural knock-on effect, which is that people feel that if that's the response, they're not really going to ask for the feedback and the coaching, and you end up in a kind of negative spiral. And in my blogs, I talk about that, and I talk about the fact that it's actually, if you have the right mindset, it's actually quite easy to break out of that spiral. And, when that happens, the benefits and the sort of multiplier knock-on effects are huge.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And then just in terms of the individual, the coaching side, because I think that's obviously there is a lot that you mentioned coaching and the commitment to coaching in an organization and it not always been followed through. And I think some junior people are completely unaware of what coaching could bring for them. But the fact that everybody at a senior level is probably getting it or should be, and that they can themselves put themselves on a coaching journey maybe before it's included in a benefits package. And I suppose if you could maybe talk me through a little bit the approach to coaching that you have. And in particular, I always like to ask, what do people often underestimate about the power of coaching or the power that they have to control their destiny?
Okay, you have to forgive me if this is a slightly long answer, Ethan, because I think there are a number of different factors at play here. One of them is what I would call formal coaching, where you work with a coach. Your organization will say, pay for you to have 6 or 8 coaching sessions, maybe once a month for 6 to 8 months. And these are often offered to people who are progressing in the organization. They've been promoted. They go from, managing consultant, to take a consulting example, to principal and then ultimately to partner. And they get these coaching opportunities to help them make the transition. It's very formal. And as you say, it's generally not on offer to juniors. And that's undoubtedly something that these organizations should rethink, because that's often the point at which coaching could be most helpful. But that's one type of coaching. What I also talk about is what I call everyday coaching. If you think, coaching is a very formal set piece activity once a month with a formal accredited coach, it's always going to seem a little bit remote and a big privilege to have it and a great rarity. I'm a great believer in what I call informal or everyday coaching, which can be peer-to-peer, it can be manager to subordinate, but where you literally at any moment on any day, you can just sit down and together work through a particular issue. It could be a work issue, it could be a stress-related issue, it could be a life choice that somebody is facing. But instead of thinking, I'm going to need, a very formal scheduled moment in order to have this conversation, you can just have it as part of your everyday interaction in the workplace. You can unblock obstacles that way. You can create trust. You can create promote collegiality by working like that. And that is an easy thing to do, and it very seldom happens. So that's what I think is the kind of coaching that I strongly advocate in the workplace. And then the third kind of a coaching, which is actually something I'm putting a lot of my time and energy into at the moment, is coaching to people who might not be in an organization now because they're looking for work, or they are in an organization, but the kind of coaching they want is not coaching they particularly want to do with their organization, because it's very personal, it's very related to the kinds of choices and pathways that they're thinking about for themselves. And so this is coaching which is really about helping people get a better understanding of who they are, what it is that they're looking for from life and from the work that they do, what the different options are out there that they might be following, and how they might start to take action and, make some of these dreams and hopes actually come true. That flows directly into your other question, Ethan, which is about, what are the things people tend to underestimate about themselves? The things that I find that people underestimate, firstly, is what they bring into the room every time they enter the room, this portfolio of assets. It could be hard skills, it could be soft skills, it could be a way of thinking, it could be an attitude, it could be a raft of experience. Very importantly, what they might be bringing in is resilience and the ability and experience of having and managing setbacks. The other thing that I think people underestimate is, something that's been written about extensively, but that's the value of experimentation and of range, of trying different things and not feeling that as soon as they leave school or leave university, they have to only be on one particular path, but that they can try out different things to see what the best fit is. And they will find that by the time they do find what the best fit is from all these different experiences and different experiments they've had, they're bringing knowledge, they're bringing learning, they are bringing a particular response to situations and challenges that will be helpful in whatever area they land up in. And without wanting to talk too much, the last thing I would say in response to your question is that just as people underestimate the value that they can bring into the room themselves by having a better understanding of what it is they bring, people also tend to overestimate things like arbitrary hierarchical ladders or arbitrary status symbols. They tend to overemphasize or overfixate on what other people might be thinking or expecting. They build castles in the air about, what they think they should be doing or what a good career looks like, and have they reached it, or have they somehow miscalculated and missed it. And these are often hugely self-generated areas of stress and pressure and unhappiness that a change in mindset and a different way of looking at the world could relieve and alleviate.
That's so interesting and incredibly comforting, actually, to hear that there is the power to reframe things, and that maybe we have mental blocks about organizations, how they operate, that perhaps are stuck in the past. So that's really, really helpful.
We definitely do, Ethan, and there are ways to reframe. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. I'd love to now just move to some closing reflections. So you've had a long career that's taken you across different geographies. I'd love to ask if there were any, since you do coach about overcoming challenges, in your own case, were there any setbacks that maybe had a formative effect on you?
Well, I mean, I have had many setbacks. I mean, we could spend the whole night just talking about the various setbacks or things that I might have hoped to achieve, which didn't actually come to pass. I mean, some of the things I was saying about what people underestimate and what they overestimate, I'm talking about myself just as much as I'm talking about my clients or the colleagues or experiences that I've had in my time with other people. Because I think when you set out on a career, you do have a particular expectation of what success looks like and what it must be and the markers you have to hit. And if you don't hit those markers, you can feel that you've failed in some way, or, there's some sort of inadequacy. You don't measure up, other people are better than you are, and so forth. So I'd say for me, I mean, one of the things that I've had to do is to say, yes, I know that this is how I think, and I know that my mind is going this way, and I need to break out of it. I need to recognize that I'm thinking like this. I need to recognize that it's primarily my own construct to think like this, and it is therefore in my power and in my control not to think like that, to think instead about other aspects of my life and my work, which are affirming to me and which are the things I really want to focus on. And so that's one of the reasons why 10 years ago, I left the world of corporate consulting and struck out on my own. And the reason for that is that I wanted to move away from things that felt like they were energy drains to me, and instead focus very strongly on the things that gave me energy, that did engage me, that kind of brought out the best in me. So I'll give you an example of, let me be concrete about it. What I like about work that I do and the consulting that I do is I like the delivery side of it. I like the human engagement with clients and teams. I like the intellectual challenge of the kinds of problems that we are looking at and trying to solve. I like the roll up your sleeves, get into the room together with the whiteboard, look for solutions jointly, work with the people who are going to be formulating solutions and ultimately implementing them. That's what I like to do. I'm not great at the sales side of things. That's kind of not me. I was working in an environment where that became the most important thing. And I needed to break out of that and create an environment for myself where the thing that I am good at and that I do like doing was kind of front and center. That's kind of an example of how I took what was clearly a setback for me and clearly something that was, resulting in me somewhat spinning my wheels, and turned it instead into an opportunity to reshape my life, to reshape the way that I work, and to put myself in a situation where, kind of on a daily basis, I was getting the best out of myself rather than feeling at the mercy of the worst of myself.
Well, thank you for that very candid reflection. And on the course of a career, we often encounter people who are influential for us, or again, contribute to that formative stage, or else it could be outside your career entirely. But I always ask people to mention if there's anyone that owes something to, or that was particularly meaningful. And it's not an exhaustive list. I can imagine there have been many.
I mean, there have been in my life very many. I mean, I would start with my parents. My parents were South African lawyers. My mother, kind of an extraordinary woman. She was a doer. My mother was somebody who would look at a problem and look for a solution to it and go and make that thing happen. And she did that again and again. And she was an extraordinary influence to me, but I think to probably thousands, tens of thousands of people in South Africa. And I would say she was a huge influence on the fact that I really care about the tangible outcomes of the work that I do, which I mentioned at the start. My father, who's a leader in his field, but was able to be focused, incredibly focused on his work, and yet at the same time to be open to the rest of the world. So he had a very, very full life. The way he thought about his work, but the way that work fitted into the rest of his life. It's also been a great role model for me, that life and work should go together. They should complement each other. They should reinforce each other. And I think my father's example is really one I think about all the time as a role model for what I would like my life to look like. And, other members of my family have been immensely influential to me. My brother, who kind of taught me early on the value of get it down, work fast, was what he would always say to me. Work fast, get it down. It doesn't have to be perfect. The perfect is the enemy of the good or the excellent. Once you have put down your thoughts, you can then work them up, you can refine them, you can improve them. But if you are waiting for it to be perfect, A, it'll never be perfect, but B, you'll probably never do it at all. That was a really critical piece of advice that, again, I keep close to me all the time. And then, so many other people, just people who have shown me what extraordinary kindness looks like in action, people whose lives are sort of filled with consideration, acts of extraordinary generosity. These are people who I think of frequently. I look at what they've done for me, what they've done for others. They're also great role models. I guess maybe what I'm saying even is I'm quite influenceable because there are many influences in my life and I do think about them pretty frequently.
That's wonderful. And I also felt at INSEAD that I think we all felt the force of your parents and the important work that they had done. I think their reputations sort of went before them in that sense. So thank you for honoring them here. I think just my final, just concluding thought is, do you have any nugget of wisdom to leave us with, in addition to the multiple layers of wisdom you've given us here, just as a final question? Could be advice for your younger self. Could be a creed or motto.
You mentioned to me, Ethan, what advice would you give to your younger self? And I think that is a good way of thinking about it. The advice that I give to my younger self is there's a lot more to life than you suppose. There's a lot more you can do. There are a lot more options open to you than you think. You have got the space to be creative and to experiment and to test things out. And so to feel that you have to define your life purpose and, the single path that you have to follow, 21, 22, 23, is just imposes this tremendous sense of burden, of pressure on you that you do not need to have. So that would be the one thing. And the other piece of advice that I would give to myself, to my younger self, is what the hell are you waiting for? Just go down to the sea and start sailing. That is what I would say to myself.
I love it. Well, it reminds me of those long runs we did in the forests of Fontainebleau 25 years ago, when I think we knew we were training for a marathon, but it's a bit like the life as a marathon, not a sprint adage. So thank you so much, Matthew. The richness, I remember then, has only been amplified now. And thank you for sharing your work so publicly. Thank you for the work that you're doing at a very granular level, person by person, to make their careers more comfortable, more in control. And thank you for contributing to this podcast.
Thank you so much, as I say, Ethan, for inviting me. And as I say, what a pleasure to have a chance to talk to you.
I'm Ethan Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring professionals and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.